So welcome, Christian, and please introduce yourself.
Merci, Javi. I'm Christian Busch. I am co-directing the Innovation Center at the London School of Economics, where we look into business model innovation in different contexts. So we have anthropologists, development people, management people, looking into what are the success and failure patterns, what we see in terms of how does an idea scale up, what are the learnings. And then we teach that to different programs. So we have some master programs, executive MBA programs, where we teach our students how to come from an idea to scale and then send them over to different companies to work with it on the ground. We also do a lot of workshops and advisory around this. A lot of content and research around it. And some of the things I'm most interested in at the moment are twofold. The first is around how do you actually scale without a lot of resources and without having all the fancy technologies of the world. So we work a lot in low-income contexts where you see that ideas a lot of times that are driven by local entrepreneurs that have community buy-in scale very quickly if they understand what the actual real needs are on the ground. Give an example, we talked about RLabs earlier, which takes simple mobile phones where people can consult each other, developed into a social media training program, scaled it up into 20 countries because they understood that people in other communities might also have the thirst for it when they sit the whole day in a local hospice and have nothing to do. And you don't need a fancy technology for that. The only thing you need is an understanding of the context and then using the existing at-hand resources that are already there to develop a methodology. So that's the one part I'm excited about. How do you scale up things without a lot of resources needed? And the second one is around what we talked about in the morning, around impact organizations and how I believe that kind of the business of the future will integrate profit and purpose on the same strategic level. It will enable the employees to make money at the same time as they have meaning, and in a way kind of gets away from this idea that a business is only there to make a profit, which I think is a fallacy, because then we get into the idea of there's a for-profit and there's a non-for-profit. But I believe over the next 5 to 10 years they will merge. And we will basically do well and good at the same time, but not only to make more profit, but actually because that is why we built business in the first place.
In Silicon Valley, we say that 9 of 10 startups fail, 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10. Why do startups fail?
Well, I could have a philosophical and a practical answer. I'll start with the practical one, which is obviously around team, around product, and around resources, right? I believe that most of them fail because of the team, because resource and everything else usually follows if you have a good team and a relatively good idea, but the idea changes as well. So in the end of the day, it's the grit of the entrepreneur and the team around it. But the philosophical answer also is that I do believe that ideas and experimentation needs failure, and it needs the idea that you can't always have it right. And I think one way actually to decrease failure is to think about it more in terms of learning and not seeing isolated failures, but rather say this is a journey. Within this journey there will be failures and there will be successes, but what's important is what comes from it in terms of learnings. And what I think then what happens is that if you use things like design thinking, where you don't think about a great idea and then push it out there and then, the chances 1 to 10 that actually it could be adopted or not, you actually turn it around and say, what is the real issue here? What is the real problem here? And then you develop solutions that people actually want, which is A, better for not failing that much, but B, it's also actually more helpful for both society but also for yourself in the long run.
Something that actually reconnects with your theme about developing, scaling a startup with lower resources or less resources. In Silicon Valley, one of the reason why startups fail is perhaps they have because they have too much investment. There's too much money, actually too much resources, and it creates just bad behavior, spending too much and trying to scale maybe even too fast. So. Do you think that maybe with actually less resources you can increase the success of startups?
I think it's a good point. To me, this is all about timing. I think there's good times for investment and there's bad times for investment. I think the bad time for investment is at the beginning when you first need to prove that you actually have something that people want. And where if you put money too easily in it, then yes, you develop a lot of interesting stuff. But unless you are an Uber or one of the kind of very few companies that can pull it off to grow extremely fast without actually making a lot of money, but having a lot of hope in it, I think it is usually nicer and better to first develop a product that people actually can buy and then get investment in order to go to the next stage rather than to get investment to survive. And I think in the end of the day, the reason why I'm so excited about the kind of necessity-based entrepreneurship in low-income countries is that they in a way show us how you can develop scaled solutions in ways that don't need a lot of resources. Of course, at a certain point then, we don't have the ecosystem there. That is why nobody really scales globally. But if you would take the solutions that are locally already established, that really solve a problem, and then you come in, I think that's where real scale happens. So I think it's all about timing.
It's interesting because looking from Silicon Valley, from the US, we see Europe as more of this developing market where in terms of maybe not pure innovation, but at least in scaling startups and ideas where valuation in Europe are perhaps around 10 times less than the US, and same thing for investments. So when do you think, or will this gap actually ever diminish or between Europe and the US and Silicon Valley, or do you think this is just really a lack of ecosystem and that just will stay like this?
I feel it comes to the question of, is it actually desirable, these kind of valuations? Putting it differently, I'm all in for developing stronger ecosystems that help people to get investments. I'm all in to say we need an ecosystem where people at good times can scale up. I'm not sure we need these ideas of having $1 billion investment or $1 billion valuation after 2 years of growth, in the sense of when you look at ecosystems and when you look at technology ecosystems and what kind of stays the test of time, I think what we discussed earlier was the question of radical innovation versus incremental innovation. And I think the US, and particularly Silicon Valley, are more into radical innovation, right? You can have an Uber that says we radically reinvent how traffic maneuvering works, and this is a solution, and now we can be valued at this, and it might be or might not be justified. I think in Europe, particularly in Germany as well, you have more incremental innovation where people might not come up with the next Uber, but they might come up with a really interesting process innovation that helps you now to do better what you did before. So it is an innovation, but it is much more incremental. It will never have that type of valuation, but it might be the one that actually will be sustained for the next 20 years. All these medium-sized companies, they have been surviving for 200 years. And so I think in the end of the day, for me, the question always is, what do we actually need and want? And I'm not sure the volume and the value of things is the measure we should look at. I think the measure for me is more, what is long-term sustainability, both financially, but also what actually helps society here. And when I look at, being honest, the different types of societies, I feel that societies in Europe are actually very healthy. And I'm not sure we would need this divergence where you have these kind of valued or overvalued companies and then the rest of the medium-sized companies here. I think it is quite healthy to have a certain balance. I do agree that, yes, we need a better kind of investment ecosystem in terms of, particularly when it comes to later stage investments, where a lot of the companies actually go to the valley to get these. But at the same time, I'm also quite convinced that the societal structures we have are actually relatively healthy for a lot of kind of, in a way, having a more distributed approach towards investment.
But with that gap, don't you think that the most successful companies, innovative companies in Europe, would actually just, as you say, move to the valley? And so when you see Spotify and Skype and all those companies that actually have achieved this kind of scale, are actually leaving Europe and coming to the valley. Don't you think that? Perhaps some of the model is they are keeping their R&D center in Europe, but really the intelligence is moving to the valley. So is there anything that can be done to prevent or at least decelerate this brain drain, basically?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because in a way it seems to sometimes be this circle where, or this development where people build something, let's say in Europe, they go to the US, they scale, and then they partly come back. Or you see, opening a subsidiary then later. Or so I'm not 100% convinced of the brain drain. I 100% agree that in this period of scaling and where people want to do kind of like the next big step, it happens with a valley. What I see a lot though is then kind of like a lot of people coming back to Berlin, coming back to London and building either a subsidiary or a different type of business with the learnings. Having said that, I completely am in favor of thinking more strategically about what are the pillars of an ecosystem that are really needed, that is actually powerful enough to not only have a top university and a top incubator, but to understand, okay, we need a certain culture of innovation. We need a certain idea of how they actually now help entrepreneurs. You can have as much startup funding from the government and from investors. If there's no culture of allowing to fail, you will never have people taking real risks. So you will never, in a way, need all that money. So in a way, I think it comes on the level of culture. And the way kind of to influence that, I feel, is mostly through role models. Like having people empowered who did it in that context and say, look, these guys can do it. It's an alternative career path. It actually works. You can do that as well. And then having all that kind of support stuff come in. But we had a discussion earlier about the efficiency and the efficacy of incubators. And that a lot of times they can actually be harmful. And a too supportive environment might actually then derail from real innovation. Think about the really big innovation that's happening when it comes to also social impact. It's mobile banking, it's microfinance, and they didn't come from the Silicon Valley. So the point also being that I think that real radical innovation a lot of times happens in completely resource-constrained environments because there's a clear problem. People pick up that problem and say, let's think about the whole institutional frame here and let's put it out there. So I'm sometimes not sure about the glorification of the valley because I feel like the real innovation, when you go to Kenya, when you go to South Africa, there's really interesting stuff happening. And so in a way it's the reverse, that actually having a problem and having no support ecosystem creates opportunity. So I feel like the interesting thing there is I think there's a lot to learn from the valley, but there's also a lot to learn from Kenya, South Africa, and so on.
Great. That's actually very interesting, and it's true that there are very deep innovation, real innovation happening everywhere in the world. But the question is that if you want that innovation to scale, the only place today is really to come to the US or to the Valley, just because of infrastructure. There are very few teams who are able to manage a data center of the scale of Facebook or Amazon. And the other thing is with this wave of entrepreneurs coming to the Valley, you were talking about in Silicon Valley, there is more of a radical innovation, disruptive innovation, and isn't it because actually it's not necessarily the entrepreneur in Silicon Valley that are innovators, but there are so many people coming in with so many ideas. They're attracted by what's happening, and that creates that they have those radical innovation coming from outside the valley, but they come here and it goes much faster than it scales. Like Uber started, the idea emerged in Paris, but it scaled in San Francisco and the U.S. So that's why, I mean, it's a bit sad that just the idea. Maybe you have an opposite view, but that this brain drain, the Valley is attracting so many of those innovators, and that leaves the rest of the world almost innovationless. by the force of time.
It's a very interesting point. Also, I just came back actually from Chile and from before that from Saudi Arabia, and they have in a way the kind of opposite approach to a lot of other settings. So in a lot of settings you would see that kind of it happens more bottom up, right? Where you have investors like in the UK, which I loved, is people like Sol Klein, who are brilliant investors who set up Index and other kind of interesting firms that now more and more try to foster like an environment where Skype could happen in Europe as well. So you have the kind of bottom up movement of investors saying, hey, look, let's be better in promoting this, and then the government coming in partly to support that. And then in Saudi Arabia and Chile, you have programs like Startup Chile, or in Saudi Arabia, the economic city, where they try to very consciously, centrally planned, say, this is how we could try to create a startup ecosystem. And so Startup Chile, for example, was interesting because it said, we take people from the outside to come here to develop something, give them money for it. It was more early stage, but still an experiment. And I think there's a value in experimenting with these different models to say, hey, look, if we are the UK, we should have a mixed model. We should have something where you say, you have entrepreneurs like Sol Klein set up their funds, kind of in a way showing people, hey, there is now actually an environment where this investment can happen, but then also the government saying, hey, look, we have the right kind of regulation around what it means now to, employment regulation, all the different type of regulations that you are concerned with when you scale up. And I think it kind of like, for me, is always the kind of combination between top down and bottom up, and really getting that right and learning from these different approaches from Startup Chile, from the economic zones in Saudi Arabia, from the Silicon Valley, but not only from the Silicon Valley, because I think the Silicon Valley is so unique in its kind of composition, right? You have Stanford there, you have the Y Combinator there, you have the kind of employers there. So recreating this will always fail because you will always miss one of the factors. So I think you have to see the local context, understand what is the local culture, and then saying, okay, contingent on this, like what do we really need here? And I think a lot of times it's actually real role models and people who actually did it. And I think this is more and more emerging now with the kind of first, people like Sol Klein really pushing it forward.
With all the, all the lessons and the studies around, how to innovate, how to build a startup, what could larger enterprises learn from it? How could they, there's this theme about co-innovation, about trying to build this maybe a small groups inside the company, or to foster innovation. So what would be your advice for larger enterprises to foster that innovation?
I feel there's a couple of steps. The first step is it starts with corporate culture. It starts with the idea that the water cooler conversations have to be about ideas. They can't be about gossip, or they can't be about look what this person's doing. So fostering this means having management and others, being positive role models. During lunch, like you could sit in with your employees and talk about like interesting ideas and get their feedback. So creating a culture of positive feedback, of in a way the feeling that you can't fail. As in most companies, the feeling always is, oh my God, if I now say too much here, or if I don't do this right, then people will talk about me and so on. So really kind of establishing this kind of culture of innovation. The second step, really changing the approach to how to innovate. I think a lot of companies come from their competitive advantage and then say, oh, we have one more product which we can throw into the market. Rather than saying, let's take a more design thinking approach where we identify the real problem here. And even if it questions some of our core capabilities, we need to understand what people really want. We need to observe what they really want. And then based on this, develop a kind of a model that enables the stakeholders to be part of that journey, to co-create, but not only to co-create, to actually understand the incentives of the other stakeholders from day one, to work with the customers, to work with the different kind of, we've been working, for example, with an education institution, with a big one, where they from day one included the teachers, they included the governors, they included the parents, and they included the students from day one. Not only when the product is done, but from day one, what is really needed from all sides, and then you go from there, rather than throwing a solution at teachers or at parents that they have to take. So second one, really changing the approach. not coming from an idea first, but coming from the problem first, and then with the idea. The third one is really about business model innovation. Like, how do we now, once we understood the real problem, how do we innovate the value proposition? How do we innovate the revenue model and really get much more creative in the revenue model question? What I've seen a lot in developing countries is really companies emerging that, when you do these co-creation models that are really clever about how they pay people when they come up with a solution that is developed on their platform, how they have revenue sharing around this. And I think people need to get away from the idea that you have this organizational boundary and value has to be only appropriated in there, to actually, hey, no, if we co-create value outside the company, we have to also have a proper revenue sharing model that actually attributes to it. So really kind of thinking about much more creative revenue models and how they can be developed, and then which type of network do you need for this? Which actually comes to the fourth point, which is around governance. How do you understand that an organization nowadays will not be able to keep their structure intact? In 5 to 10 years, it will be much more networked. It will be an organization where you need to understand that you can't really say if it's an employee or a freelancer or a contractor. This will be a fluid structure, and you need to see in terms of that now already you have the opportunity to work with startups, to work with other companies on kind of cooperative models. So you understand that there are certain areas of competition, but other areas of cooperation. And if you shield yourself too much, then you have a problem. Give you an example. I think it was Vodafone and O2 or so a couple of years ago who said, look, we're stupid that we're competing on all levels. We don't compete, like so far we're competing with all the kind of different infrastructure, and we're competing also with the different kind of services, but actually the only competition point are the services, so why wouldn't we share the infrastructure? So why don't we do a joint venture, share the infrastructure, and then compete on where we really are supposed to compete, rather than building in parallel all these different things. So I think the last pillar is really understanding governance, but not only within the company, but also how do we create ecosystems where we think in terms of system level innovation, where if you want to be more cost effective, you need to think about which of these costs can actually be shared with competitors, which is in both companies' interest, and then you compete at another level. So I think really thinking more about that kind of things will be quite important.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christian.
Thank you, Javi.